story. I think it's time to bring on our guest for this evening, Nick French. Nick French is an assistant editor at Jackman Magazine. Thank you so much for joining us today on Left Reckoning.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Really stoked to be chatting with you. We're going to be talking about two pieces. One I talked about earlier, Marxism doesn't equal wokeness, and another piece called Don't Fall for the Myth of the Job Creator. But just to bring you into our world, Nick, we have to share this incredible video from none other than Charlie Kirk, somebody who shows up a few times in your piece, talking about a very deranged and kind of paranoid life that you have to live if you are on the right wing in America today.
We are now having to, I'm guilty of this. I'm going through my kitchen, I'm going through my refrigerator, and I'm starting to ask the question, well, is this ketchup bottle woke? Is this mustard? I mean, literally, we're at the place now where we have to go through, is the company that makes this? And so, blackoutcoffee.com/Charlie, I'm sure many of you are coffee drinkers because you're high end.
Wow.
I think it's been a really beautiful gift from the right wing recently to give the left Chick-fil-A, Bud Light, and Cracker Barrel, and I just say keep them coming. But this kind of deranged, right wing freak out about companies and wokeness. It's funny. It's pretty. There's an aspect of it that Matt and I have been trying to make the point. It's like, it seems sort of new, but they've always been doing this kind of thing. Before it was woke, it was political correctness and getting worked up about that, right? But one thing that I think interests us a lot on this show has been like how they've been trying to attach that to Marxism. And we have this from Charlie as well, which you cited in your piece, which is about this kind of secret Marxism that's behind wokeness, and he has a woke rating that's been created here. But here he calls CRT Marxism in schools, DEI Marxism in hiring, ESG Marxism in finance, LGBT Marxism in identity, BLM Marxism and in race. And the new one, CEI Corporate Equity Index, Soros-funded Marxism and corporate governance. Nick,
Soros-funded Marxism as opposed to just Marxism. That's
Nick, are we winning right now? Is Marxism in power in the United States of America?
Yeah, I wish we could say that. But yeah, no, it is funny in a way, but like you said, David, it has a long history. Political correctness is kind of one version of it, especially if we're looking at the idea that there's a kind of like authoritarianism on the left, such that, if you step out of line, if you say the wrong things, you're going to be canceled. What did they say before canceled? What happened if you were?
They might have just had to use normal English, be fired, right?
Yeah, you're going to be fired. People will be not nice. People don't want to be your friend anymore. But as I discussed in the piece, it really goes back to this theory of cultural Marxism, which itself is kind of a reinvention of the Nazi line about Jews and how the Jewish people were simultaneously like global capitalists, but also behind Bolshevism and global communism. This kind of conspiratorial thing that links a bunch of things that are seemingly unrelated, but really there's a few insidious Jewish intellectuals behind it all. So the cultural Marxist theory in particular that became popular after World War II said that basically Jewish intellectuals who immigrated to the States, including especially the Frankfurt School, thinkers like Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse, were really the source of everything that ailed America from the right-wing point of view, right? Like, not only were they advocating for Marxism, but in fact, movements for civil rights, for, the feminist movement, for gay rights, all of these were kind of Marxism in a transmogrified form that, left-wing professors had indoctrinated the youth to
Yeah. Yeah, without Horkheimer, we wouldn't have had the civil rights movement, and Jim Crow would still be around, I guess.
Right, right.
And it's like it's interesting, like in the way that they talk about it, I think is different from like maybe like a more accurate reading of like the New Left, for example. But like, and I won't put you on the spot to like condemn the Frankfurt School unless you want to, which you're very welcome to. But like a lot of Marxists, for example, see that cultural turn to be a huge decline in like Marxism as like as a political philosophy, in the sense of it having like political weight, right? This retreat to the university, right? This over focus on culture, versus maybe a more traditional Marxism, which was more focused on like class in general. That it's always funny to me when you hear like James Lindsay's or Charlie Kirk. I think James Lindsay might at least be able to do this a little bit more intelligently than Charlie Kirk. Make this argument that like basically it's this kind of secret that they've uncovered, right? This like secret hidden plot from society, right? Which is why your alarm bell should start ringing when you also hear it attached to Soros, right? Again, like Soros is no Marxist. This is a guy who made a lot of money, in finance, right? I'm curious, like, to hear your thoughts on like why they think that this is such a an effective tool for them to basically be able to criticize maybe sort of more recent like social justice movements, we could call them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's basically because of the legacy of the Cold War and the Red Scare. I mean, I think they're probably mistaken about how effective this is as a rhetorical strategy, at least in today's day and age. But I think the idea is that if we associate everything we don't like, any kind of liberal or progressive causes, even relatively shallow ones like DEI or ESG, if we associate that with socialism or Marxism, those are much scarier, maybe more foreign seeming ideas. Again, they invoke this specter of authoritarianism. So yeah, they say they just want to like hire more women or more racial minorities on corporate boards, but really that's just the start of like setting up gulags, right? So I think that's the rhetorical tack, right?
And I mean, I think what's interesting about all of it is like on both sides, right? Because in a second we can maybe talk about some of the more Marxist or socialist criticisms of like these new corporate initiatives, right? But I think across the board, what's interesting about this is like there's a side of this that is like elite politics. And what I mean by that is it's just like how do corporate boardrooms look, or even how do universities look, right? From like the left progressive side, maybe, supporting those kind of endeavors, but also from the Republican side, because they're like, they don't want their kids who go to the nice universities and these schools to be exposed to this kind of stuff, or they don't want their boards to reflect these kind of values, right? Like this is like a battle between well-to-do groups in America.
Sorry, just to add on to that, I remember watching Dave Rubin, and it sunk into me like, oh, we're talking to different audiences. He's talking to actually like he can be that stupid because he's performing for like board members who are like anti-woke or whatever, right? And so he'll say like, oh yeah, if they say we need like this much representation on TV, they're going to say it about your boardroom too. And it's like, that's never something I've ever been concerned about, man. Like,
yeah, no, I think that's right. I think that's insightful. I mean, I think, the vast majority of Americans, like working class people, poor people, most middle class people for that matter, yeah, why should they give a fuck who is on the the board, of Disney or whatever? And then it's like, yeah, people up in arms about, affirmative action, or like what is the AP school history curriculum. I saw a good, I think maybe it was Sam Adler Bell who made a point about Ron DeSantis's message really pitched in the you guys described. It's focused on the like neuroses of the right wing elite. And privileged professionals, right? And it's not necessarily something that has a resonance with less wealthy people or working class people. I mean, did you guys see the clip recently where Donald Trump was sort of even like mocking the kind of obsession with wokeness? I thought that was
Yeah.
a really interesting
Yeah,
moment.
yeah, where he said that. I mean, that's the. I think him versus DeSantis is going to draw these dynamics out in a very interesting way because he's like, yeah, wokeness is something everyone says, but I don't like it because nobody knows what it means. And I also think he probably saw when that one woman was Bethany Mandel was on Brianna Joy Gray's show and couldn't define it. And it's like, oh,
Oh
this is a
yeah,
bad look for our side.
right.
Yeah, I mean, like, and I'll just say, for the right, which give them some credit, like they can sometimes be good at branding. Like Death Tax was great.
Right.
Death Tax worked very well because it sounded so awful. I can't remember what the one was, Obamacare, something similar to
Death
death, right?
panels.
Death panels, right? I guess that's a theme, but like, I'm sorry, it's like way too many acronyms. Like, I follow this stuff sort of for a living, or the discourse generally, and like I always have to remind myself what ESG is, CEI and things like that. I do wonder how like effective it will be. And as we were sort of joking around about before the show, like, you know, at a certain point, if like the pitch for the right wing is like don't watch baseball or football anymore, and you have to buy special coffee from our non-woke friends, I don't know how much of a popular movement that could be. But look, like these are conversations like that have been happening. I think there's no doubt about it that like there's been a cultural reckoning over the past decade, and I think a lot of people either embrace it or there's been some resistance to it. I mean, like I was wondering, Nick, if you wanted to talk a little bit about like separating these kind of movements from like Marxism or socialism as a philosophy, because I do think that like I don't know, it could be sometimes a difficult line to draw.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that Marxists are opposed to oppression and support racial equality, gender equality, sexual freedom,
Mhm.
all of that. I think that what Marxists object
Oh, you might have clipped out there.
Oh yeah, let's see here.
to is the
Oh,
way that
now
But
you're
Nick,
back.
liberal.
Nick, so we lost you for a second. You were just saying what Marxists object to.
Sorry, yeah. What they object to is the way that liberals try to advance these causes and also often weaponize them against the left, and they use them in ways that are more about claiming the moral high ground than actually helping people, especially less privileged people. So oftentimes, if Ron DeSantis's anti woke politics is an elite politics, well, what he's responding to is an elite politics, right? It's
Mhm.
about um, diversifying the incoming college classes at the most elite institutions of higher education. It's about diversifying, corporate boardrooms, right? Like the sort of highest, seats of power the in the United States and in the world. It's making sure people use the right language
Mhm.
in a very sort of clinical way, and oftentimes it's used to distract from or to, as Hillary did in 2016 against Bernie, to put down leftist proposals for redistribution or universal social programs that would help everyone and especially help, you know, women, racial minorities, the people who are disproportionately harmed by economic disadvantage and being workers in a capitalist society.
Yeah, I mean Bernie was attacked both ahead of both Iowa primaries in 2016 and 2020 as being somehow sexist or sus on these issues, when in fact his material program would have been, the most beneficial for any of these metrics by far.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, in its most insidious forms, I think it kind of reifies existing inequalities and hierarchies. I saw someone in the chat mention Robin DiAngelo, right, which is sort of almost a caricature of this stuff, except that she's a real person who actually does this for a living, where it's really about, if you're white, you should turn inward and focus on all of the bad thoughts in your head, and really distracting people from actually changing the world. There are people who are advocating kind of like race essentialism, where it's like, oh, people of certain races are naturally less rational or less logical. It's like really toxic stuff that's just white supremacy in another.
Yeah, sorry. I think you clipped out again. Sorry, brother.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries, no worries. Yeah, I think that like this gets to like one of the like an important bit too, where like I think that like there should be some level of like recognizing from the left, from like the socialist left, of like recognizing one, like the severe need for a lot of reckonings in this country, be they like racial or in gender or in sexuality, right? And it's like recognizing that like people are certainly oppressed, but also being able to challenge this kind of liberal view of it, which like individualizes a lot of the problems and oftentimes like leaves out power out of these things, right? I mean, this is the point with Robin DiAngelo, for example, is that like instead of like recognizing, for example, like the reason that like certain groups in this country have been exploited at high levels by capitalism, instead it is like something inherent in you as an individual. And even particularly in the way that her like seminars are done, right? It's like you, the employee, right? Somebody who is like limited power in your corporate structure, is like you're the reason that this is the way, instead of like the entire profit motive or the entire system that creates these problems.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I mean, just to kind of give a very quick gloss on the way that I think Marxists think about it, or should think about it, is like we want to build a movement to redistribute wealth and power from the capitalist class and the most privileged professionals to the working class. Ultimately, we want to go beyond that, democratize the economy, society more broadly. Now, in doing that, well, first of all, we think that that's going to disproportionately benefit, racial minorities, women who have been most harmed by the capitalist system, who have historically been excluded from better jobs, or have been forced to take worse jobs, or they've suffered the disproportionately the violence of the state, the police state, the prison system. So we think that's going to benefit everyone, and much more so than DEI or ESG, any of the alphabet soup woke things.
I'm really holding out for ESG. I think it's gonna that and AI. I think we're really gonna turn things around for us.
Right. But just to continue on that, we also think that it is important to challenge, individual prejudice, bigotry, discrimination, but we do it because we think that's necessary to building this broader coalition that can benefit everyone. And we think that things like racism, things like racialized police violence, sexual discrimination, sexual harassment, they weaken us as a class, and they make it easier for capitalists to pit us against each other. They make it easier for them to exploit, desperate workers who are afraid of getting deported, or who are afraid of becoming homeless and becoming the victims of the police state, and so on. So, if we're charitable to the liberal wokes, we share a lot of their goals, assuming they're sincere about that, but we have a totally different vision of how to achieve them and how that fits into a project of social transformation.
I mean, like, I'm curious what you think about this, but just bringing up like a historical example that maybe might like help make this point for folks. I've been reading a lot about the Southern um, tenant farmers union in the South, right? And this is at a time, when we lived, I mean, incredibly segregated society. I mean, like the height, right? We're talking about the Jim Crow South here. Also, like high levels of exploitation for workers. I mean, being sent out and being in poverty, was a death sentence, for many people, and it was something that was always present. You also had a state that was advocating against working people, right? So, like, if you came across your boss, the state would oftentimes join your boss and either throw you in prison, or in other times, like, sheriffs would just straight up murder people. And what ends up happening here, well, these workers who were all in the same situation, both white and black, realized that by coming together and creating this very strong union, they could get more concessions than if they sort of bargained separately. Because, for example, if the white members created a white only union, well, then, like, there's a lot of black people in the South, and they can those wages and contracts can be undercut by using that kind of labor,
Yeah.
and vice versa, right? Both ways. And what ends up happening with this union is like really incredible. They win tremendous victories. And what do they end up doing with a lot of money? You have some of these cooperative farms that are set up that are desegregated in the South before the civil rights movement, right? Something that was actually showing practically what a different future could look like. And that came from people joining together and fighting for, economic democracy and economic freedom. And social justice and like equality and fighting against racism were central tenets, and we're critical to this institution. But for it to be extremely effective, it was attached also to the system that oftentimes creates those kind of bigotries, or creates the logic for the state and the powerful to try to enforce, for example, like racial hierarchies in the South, right? And like you see this like practically in American struggle all the time. And like now, for some reason in 2020, making those kind of arguments, I'm like stuck in the past 2023, making that argument, can seem controversial, right? And I think a big part of it has been that there has been this kind of move to try to take away from that history, and instead replace it with something that is more corporate friendly, that is less threatening to the very powerful, because they're very happy to pay a consultant a bunch of money, to hand out spreadsheets to people about like their inherent issues, versus like actually restructuring the way that their companies work, and the relationship with people and workers in the general public.
Yeah, yeah, very well said. I mean, that's a great example of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union. But really, there's a whole history. I mean, basically, the history of the civil rights movement and its historic connection to labor and to the socialist and communist left in this country. It's been kind of erased, and I think people are now starting to recover it, sort of post Occupy, post BLM, post Bernie. More people are learning about and talking about those historical connections. But yeah, I mean, the major leaders of the civil rights movement, Baird Rustin, A. Philip Randolph, they came out of the labor movement. They came out of the socialist left, right? Like, and the Communist Party, socialists, after a certain point at least, mostly saw the project of equal rights for Black Americans as bound up with a greater project of class struggle, redistribution, expanding democracy throughout society and the economy. And yeah, people don't talk about that. I mean, it's almost being in Jacobin world, it almost feels a bit rote to make all these points these days. But like people forget that MLK, that I Have a Dream speech, that was given at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which was promoting a broad vision of social democracy that would benefit everyone, along with, obviously breaking down legal discrimination, Jim Crow, etc. So I think it's really important that we, on the left, recover that history and sort of pound it into people's heads that, hey, the Robin DiAngelo way of doing anti-racism, the DEI way, that's not the only way.
But if you care about these things, this is the way to actually, tackle them.